There is a photograph taken from the International Space Station in 2012. NASA released it to the public, and most people saw exactly what they were expected to see: the blue marble. Earth at night. City lights scattered across continents like dying embers. And in the spaces between those lights, there is green. Broad, dense, unbroken green stretching across the northern latitudes and the equatorial belt. When a person looks at that image, they think forest. They think ancient. They think the world still has something primal left in it. They believe that as long as the satellite shows green, the lungs of the planet are still breathing. What if none of that is true? This is not a conspiracy theory about holograms or simulations. This is something much more disturbing because it is documented. It has a paper trail. It is signed by economists, foresters, and timber lobbyists across 2 centuries. The transformation happened in plain sight, and the reason it worked is because they changed the language before they changed the landscape. The oldest living tree we have confirmed is a bristlecone pine in the White Mountains of California. It is approximately 5,000 years old. That tree germinated when the Romans were still building roads and written language was a new technology. That single organism existed before the concept of a forest as an economic resource had ever entered a human mind. Before the industrial era, the forests of the Northern Hemisphere were not just collections of trees. They were massive, irregular biological machines. European oak forests before the medieval period grew trees with trunk diameters exceeding 2 meters. A single tree of that size represents 5 centuries of uninterrupted growth. But the cathedral builders of the 12th century stripped those valleys clean, floating the giants downstream to construction sites. What replaced them was not nothing. Replacement trees grew, but they were 100 years old where the originals were 400. They were 50 years old where the originals were 300. From a satellite, the canopy looked the same, but the ecosystem was gone. This distinction, the difference between a canopy and an ecosystem, is the thread that, once pulled, causes the entire history of the natural world to unravel. The formal history of this erasure begins in Germany in the late 18th century. A Prussian mining official named Hans Karl von Carlowitz published a treatise in 1713. He wasn't an ecologist, he was an economist, worried about silver mines running out of wood they needed for smelting fuel. He invented a concept called Nachhaltigkeit, or sustainability. The word entered the English language through forestry 2 centuries before it ever reached environmentalism. Karlowitz's version of sustainability had nothing to do with preserving life. It was a formula for replacing a chaotic, ancient intelligence with something that could be managed like a crop. The German state forests that emerged from this philosophy were geometric. They were rows of a single species planted at intervals calculated to maximize timber yield per decade. The natural forest contained oak, beech, hornbeam, and dozens of species at varying ages. The managed forest contained only Norway spruce, in rows.
This model was celebrated by the administrators who built the 19th century world. Gifford Pinchot, the man who became the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service under Theodore Roosevelt, trained in those German state forests. He brought the model to America. He explicitly stated that the object of forestry was not to preserve trees for their own sake, but to produce the largest amount of whatever crop was needed. To the industrial mind, the mountains of the West were not ecosystems, they were farms. The fact that they contained organisms alive since before Columbus arrived was an accounting detail, not a moral consideration. But as the giants were felled, a problem emerged. The public began to notice the scale of the destruction. They saw the jagged hexagonal basalt columns and the massive flat-top mesas that looked suspiciously like organic ruins. They saw a landscape that looked like a planetary-scale quarry. This is when the second layer of the cover-up was initiated. In the 1830s, the science of geology was standardized. Men like Charles Lyell introduced the concept of uniformitarianism. They argued that every feature of the Earth, every canyon, every peak, every strange rock formation was the result of slow, silent erosion over millions of years. This gave the industrial machine a perfect alibi. If a mountain takes 1,000,000 years to form, then the stumps left behind by a global extraction are no longer evidence of a crime. They are just rock. If the Earth changes slowly, then the scars left by the timber barons are just natural features. Geology became the public relations firm for the extraction industry. It provided a natural explanation for a biological graveyard. The old growth wasn't just 200 feet tall. There are fragments in the fossil record and whispers in indigenous oral histories of biological structures so massive they generated their own microclimates. When these structures were liquidated, the debris didn't vanish. It pressurized. It petrified. It became the strata we study in textbooks. The deep time of geology serves as a mental barrier. It makes the viewer feel too small and too temporary to notice that the mountains are actually the remains of a world that was once much more alive than the one we inhabit now. Today, this accounting fiction has been institutionalized on a global scale. In 1992, at the Rio Earth Summit, nations agreed on a definition of forest that changed everything. They decided that any area with a 10% canopy cover and trees at least 2 meters high is a forest. This definition was designed to be inclusive, but its true function was to replace the original world with a profitable simulation. Under international law, a managed plantation of 6-year-old eucalyptus trees is legally identical to an undisturbed rainforest. The eucalyptus is planted to make paper. It will be cut in another 6 years. It has no fungal network, it has no multi-layered canopy, it supports no native species, but on a satellite map, it appears as green. It supports the claim that forest coverage has remained stable. It hasn't. What has remained stable is the appearance of coverage. A 2015 study found that the Earth has 3 trillion trees. The media celebrated this number because it was larger than previous estimates. What they ignored was the finding that tree density has declined by 46% since the start of human civilization. Half of the trees that existed when humans started farming are gone. And of the 3 trillion left, the proportion of old, complex, ecologically intact forest is plummeting.
A 2020 paper found that only 3% of the Earth's land surface is still ecologically intact. 3%. The rest has been simplified, managed, or replaced by green ghosts. The economists who designed this system, men like the Nobel laureate William Nordhaus, built models that treated natural ecosystems as inputs. They assumed that human-manufactured capital could substitute for natural systems. They believed a managed plantation substitutes for an old-growth forest in the same way a steel bridge substitutes for a wooden one. Same function, different material. But the biological evidence says this is a categorical error. A plantation does not filter water across a watershed. It does not form soil across geological timescales. It does not support the mycorrhizal networks that allow trees to communicate and share resources. It is a silhouette. It is the economic abstraction of a forest. When you fly over a landscape today and see green, you are looking at the 3rd or 4th generation of a tree crop. The ground itself has changed. The soil that formed over thousands of years under the original giants is gone. The nurse logs are gone. The snag habitats are gone. What remains is a Roman aqueduct made of leaves. The stone is still standing, but the water stopped flowing 2 centuries ago. We have the statistics, we have the carbon credits, we have the sustainable forestry certifications, and yet the world feels increasingly sterile because we are the first generation to grow up entirely within the aftermath. We have forgotten what original looks like, so we accept the replacement as the baseline. The geologists gave us time to hide the loss. The economists gave us sustainability to hide the extraction. But once you understand the history of the language, you can see through the landscape. You realize that the wilderness you walk through is a managed farm. You realize that the mountains you climb are the debris of a biological era we aren't allowed to remember. The last true tree died in 1850. The green on the map is real, but it isn't alive, not in the way it used to be. And the people who remembered what the original looked like are as gone as the forests themselves. We are left with the ruins, we are left with the accounting ledgers, and we are left with the silence of a planet that has been simplified until it fits inside a spreadsheet. The question is no longer whether the trees are there. The question is what they are, and why we were taught to look at a graveyard and call it a forest.